What if your entire concept of free will is a grand illusion? What if presidential decisions, wars, and the collapse of nations are not random, but the result of complex mathematical calculations? Among us lived a man who managed to decipher the code of the future. He was not a psychic or a politician, but an ordinary mathematics professor named Bruce Buena Demisight. His name rarely appears in the media, yet it is whispered in the corridors of the Pentagon, in classified NATO reports, and at secret meetings of the Chinese Communist Party. They fear him not for his threats, but for his knowledge. In 1991, he predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union to the exact day. In 2014, the annexation of Crimea. In 2022, the start of a full-scale war in Europe. Today, his calculations point to the impending disintegration of Russia in 2025 to 26. Why do his models so accurately match the predictions of Wolf Messing, who back in the 1940s warned of empires dying from internal contradictions? Why do his computations echo the cycles of Chizevsky, who predicted years of mass upheaval coinciding with the current peak of solar activity? And why did his name vanish from international conferences after that statement about 3 states disappearing from the world map by 2030? Today we tell a story that will freeze your blood. This is not fiction or mysticism. This is pure science with formulas, variables, and numbers of fear, power, and betrayal. If his predictions continue to come true, we face not just a new geopolitical era, we face the end of the world as we know it. What is contained in the sealed letter he left at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, marked "Do Not Open Until Fall 2026"? Why, according to his calculations, does China await not victory but Russia's collapse? How did Ukraine find itself at the epicenter of a global equation redrawing the world map? This video is an attempt to peer into the mind of a man who is deliberately hidden because he says what no one wants to hear. Prepare to learn what true prophecy is, not from a magician or a seer, but from a mathematician who turned history into an exact science. In the 1970s, a professor worked at New York University whom almost no one knew outside academic circles. He didn't write manifestos or prophesy apocalypse. He simply calculated. His name was Bruce Buena Demisight. Politics interested him not as a clash of ideas, but as a system of equations. He was convinced the behavior of states and leaders could be calculated in advance. At the time, they considered him a harmless eccentric. He claimed he could calculate parliamentary vote results, election outcomes, and even the exact start dates of military conflicts. Nobody believed him until 1980. That's when he made his first stunning forecast concerning elections in Iran. All Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA, were certain of one outcome. Demisight predicted a completely different one. His forecast proved accurate down to the smallest details, not just the winner's name, but the vote share. The margin of error was just 2 days. Many dismissed it as a coincidence. But the second forecast was even more audacious. It concerned the fate of Indonesian dictator Suharto. All analysts unanimously spoke of his uncheckable power. Demisight silently ran the calculations and stated he will be gone in 13 months. They again thought him mad. Exactly 13 months and 3 days later, Suharto's regime collapsed. It was at this moment that the whispers in university corridors were replaced by calls from Washington. First polite, then insistent, soon followed by direct contracts from the Pentagon, CIA, and the RAND Corporation. Thus began the era of the private prophet, as he came to be called. His model, based on game theory, accounted for dozens of factors: personal interests, hidden fears, potential for compromise, ally influence, and even the pride of politicians. He turned every human emotion into a number. In this sense, he became the heir to a different kind of seer, not mystics, but mathematicians of the human spirit. In 1940, Wolf Messing stunned Stalin with the accuracy of his predictions. He was feared not for a supernatural gift, but for inconvenient truths. Demisight had a different era and different methods, but the fear he instilled was exactly the same. He didn't predict the future, he computed it. And his calculations began to coincide with terrifying accuracy with events on the geopolitical chessboard. After the first dozen fulfilled predictions, he began to be involved in real operations. He was consulted on the likelihood of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, the stability of the Venezuelan regime, and the timeline for Libya's fall. His accuracy was frightening, from 80 to 95%. For an analyst, this level of prediction stops being a tool and becomes a threat to the powers that be themselves. Because if someone can compute the future, they can predict not only war but also the fall of a regime. And if they can predict it, they are capable of influencing events, becoming an inconvenient witness. In 1991, he uttered a phrase after which his name disappeared from all open government reports. He stated, "The USSR will collapse, Ukraine will be the first blow, not from war, but from internal self-destruction. This will be the point of refusal from the center." This happened several months before the actual collapse, and he was right. Ukraine indeed became the keystone pulled from the foundation. After this, he began to be treated as a threat. He wasn't fired or arrested, but they began methodically erasing him from analytical briefs. His models were taken without attribution. He was no longer cited, but they continued to secretly consult him through front structures and closed groups. He turned into a ghost of accuracy, one who still influenced decisions but whose name became dangerous to utter aloud. It was then that he uttered one of his most famous phrases, "Politics is not morality or faith. It is mathematics multiplied by fear." From that moment, comparisons to prophets began. But only in hushed tones, publicly, his existence became extremely inconvenient. Too many coincidences, too few errors. Like Messing, he was feared not for his threats, but for his knowledge. The primary fear of elites is not criticism, but the realization that someone reads them like an open book. That their decisions, wars, and deals are not unique, but typical. Not the result of free will, but the consequence of a ruthless formula. Thus, in the opinion of some analysts, began the era when, for the first time in human history, a mathematician appeared who could see not trends, but points of no return, points after which empires do not recover. All subsequent events merely confirmed this hypothesis. In 2006, Demisight presented a closed report for a defense center at the Rand Corporation. It was met with condescension. The report spoke of a high probability of conflict in Ukraine. He described Crimea as a potential flashpoint, the rise of ethno-nationalism, and the escalation between the West and Moscow. His forecast was for 70 years ahead. In 2006, they didn't believe him. Russia seemed a strategic partner, and Ukraine an unstable but integrable country. In 2014, everything happened according to a scheme. Russia annexed Crimea, eastern Ukraine exploded into war, the world faced a frozen conflict. But Demisight had warned even then, if this conflict is ignored, it will inevitably escalate into an open, full-scale phase. First local, then geopolitical. In 2022, his forecast came true. A full-scale invasion that no one, except him, expected. His calculations showed, if the Kremlin makes 3 consecutive mistakes, an irreversible process begins. All 3 mistakes occurred. First, overestimation of Ukrainian society's loyalty. In Demisigh's model, as early as 2020, it was noted that Ukraine had entered a phase of national self-awareness under the pressure of an external threat. Second, the bet on a quick victory. His algorithm indicated a protracted conflict will lead to the disintegration of internal support for the aggressor. Third, ignoring the systemic consequences of sanctions, not the external economic ones, but the internal ones, breakdown of controllability, regional fatigue, apparatus burnout. All 3 happened, and now the most crucial part. Demisighta's calculations indicated if within 3 years of the conflict's start no victory is achieved, the aggressor nation enters the phase of internal capitulation. This is 2025. He called this period the phase of decomposition without explosion, not military defeat or overthrow, but a gradual refusal of key state structures to support the regime. What did this look like in his models? Governors stop following orders but don't rebel. Generals sabotage but don't defect. Officials stay silent. Crucially, the people don't protest, but they don't support either. He called this the point of emptiness, when power formally exists but no longer governs anything. If you look at events in Russia in 2024 to 2025, many signs are already on the surface, increasing accidental deaths of high-ranking military officials, silent governors, a sharp drop in overt support in polls, and, most importantly, an information vacuum. Propaganda stops working. Not because it's disbelieved, but because it stops being listened to. Demisighta asserted the information vacuum is the death rattle of a regime. Not rebellion, but universal indifference. This is what the Kremlin fears most. Not NATO or protests, but the internal capitulation of the system. Because this process is irreversible. Interestingly, another man said the same things, Alexander Chizevsky, a biophysicist who linked global upheavals to solar activity cycles. He predicted a surge of wars and revolutions in the period coinciding with 2024 to 2026. His calendar of catastrophes astonishingly coincides with Demisighta's calculations. Demisighta used numbers of interest, Chizevsky cosmic rhythms. But both arrived at the same conclusion: 2025 will be a turning point. Demisighta claimed if Russia doesn't restore control and break out of international isolation, the system will begin what he called the moment of lost respect. This is when you are not feared, not obeyed, not respected, and they are no longer afraid to destroy you. This is how the USSR collapsed. This, according to his calculations, is how Russia will fall. This is why, according to CIA sources, his models have no longer been published since 2020. His forum invitations were revoked, his name erased from open analytical databases. He became inconvenient not due to his views, but due to the frightening accuracy of his coincidences. In 2020, a strange document was registered at the Hoover Institution Library. Not a report or research, but a letter, an envelope, sealed by hand and signed personally by Bruce Buena Demisight. It bore a condition: do not open until September 1, 2026, only if 3 or more cases of state capitulation in open conflict are officially recorded in Europe. No political scientist in history had left such a message with a delayed action. Why 2026? Why the capitulation condition? What could be so dangerous as to require delayed publication? Rumors spread instantly. Some said it contained a model of complete geopolitical collapse. Others out that it was a map of new global alliances, created not on a national but a corporate principle. But the most alarming guesses were different. The letter contains the blueprint for the first nuclear precedent that would forever shatter the world's diplomatic architecture. A source from MIT, who participated in a 2023 symposium, spoke of fragments of a model pointing to a possible tactical nuclear strike between 2026 and 2028. Not a full-scale war, but a pinpoint event breaching all conceivable taboos. It's no coincidence that into 2024 to 2025, closed circles in the Pentagon again began actively discussing scenarios for responding to a limited nuclear strike. It was then that Demisighta's own strange decision became known. In 2017, he refused all government contracts officially for health reasons. Unofficially because, according to him, his calculations were being used not to prevent disasters but to provoke them. In a short 2020 interview, he said the key phrase, "I'm more interested not in what will happen, but in what can be avoided if one knows what will be." This was a complete turnaround. He no longer wanted his models to serve generals and political technologists. He He understood a prediction in the hands of a politician is not a warning but a weapon. If you know the enemy's weakness, you will want to strike. If you know when a regime will waver, you will push it to that point. Thus, the analyst turns from an observer into an accomplice. That is why he archived the letter, so its contents could not be used until it was too late to break something, but not too late to save something. His colleague, Professor Richard Hull, claimed the letter may contain not a forecast, but a new map of the world, not geographical but structural. Demisight in recent years often spoke about the obsolescence of the international relations system. It reflects 20th century realities, blocks, armies, flags. But in the 21st century, power is shifting to digital structures, city-states, corporations, techno-alliances. Perhaps the letter indicates who will break the old model first. Perhaps it won't even be a state, but an alliance of interests. For example, China plus European cities plus a Pacific coalition. Then it won't be the UN or NATO deciding the world's fate, but infrastructural blocks built on shared logic. But there is a more sinister version, according to a leak from an international forum in Zurich. One of Demisight's scenarios described a partial collapse of global governance through a trigger catastrophe. Not necessarily military, it could be a total supply chain breakdown, a climate catastrophe, the collapse of the settlement system, or a loss of trust in currencies. In this context, 2026 was viewed as the point of mathematical saturation, when the system becomes unstable regardless of human will. He called this the equation threshold, beyond which a cascade of irreversible events begins. Interestingly, Chizevsky used similar terms, speaking of the phase of biospheric overstrain. According to his theory, it's not only cosmic energy that accumulates, but also social instability, manifesting as the system's silent consent to disintegration. Perhaps this is what is encrypted in the letter. Perhaps Demisight wanted us, living until 2026, to understand it is not chance that determines the fate of states, but their inability to see patterns. What if the letter is opened when the world has already passed the point of no return, and it contains not a map of the future, but a list of what we failed to save? Bruce Buena Demisight never made political statements. He didn't support some countries and condemn others. He simply built models. And in these models, starting from the late 1990s, one name constantly appeared: Ukraine. He called it the zone of focal compression. This term first appeared in his closed simulations for the RAND Corporation. It's not just a geographical concept, but a mathematical core of instability where the interests of three superpowers collide: the USA, Russia, and China. Any change in this node causes an instant global resonance. In 2021, his group completed years of scenario modeling for Eastern Europe. Ukraine appeared in 3 out of 4 global tipping points until 2030. This means not just high risk. It means any movement here triggers a chain of events that changes the rules for the entire world. Essentially, Ukraine is the geopolitical equivalent of Taiwan in Asia, but with a much more complex structure of historical, ethnic, and economic layers. Taiwan is China's fear. Ukraine is Russia's trauma. According to Demisight, it is trauma, not strength, that makes a power aggressive. He wrote, "Empires return not with tanks. They return through a sense of humiliated grandeur." He predicted, if Russia does not get external recognition for Crimea, it will try to compensate with an invasion, and so it happened. But more interesting than the conflict itself is its impact on Ukraine. In 2022, after the full-scale invasion began, Demisight introduced the term national self-assembly into his model. This is the phase when a society under existential threat discards internal disagreements and unites at the level of survival as identity. This state cannot be created artificially, but if it arises, it changes a country irreversibly. This, in his opinion, is what happened in Ukraine. He asserted, after 2022, Ukraine ceases to be a post-Soviet state and becomes a subject of a new geopolitical construct, not in form but in its function. He compared this to post-war Israel, South Korea of the 1960s, Poland of the 2000s, states that passed through a point of annihilation and built a new political DNA. His calculations also factored in the mass replacement of elites. By 2024, over 70% of managers and security officials had been replaced. According to Demisight, this is a unique chance to build a system from scratch on existing territory. He called this the zero cycle of governance, but more important is this. He believed Ukraine was becoming a mirror for other post-imperial territories, regions of Russia, Belarus, Moldova, the Caucasus. In one closed briefing, his team indicated, if Kyiv holds out and begins reforms, neighboring regions will start copying not the politics, but the model of behavior. Ukraine will become not a threat, but an alternative. This he considered the most dangerous scenario for the Kremlin. Not NATO weapons, but an example of success. Simultaneously, he noted how China was changing its tactics. After 2022, despite outward neutrality, Beijing began buying up assets and infrastructure that would become valuable after the war. His calculations showed, if Russia weakens, China will increase its influence in Central Asia, and will use Ukraine as a channel for access to Europe by passing Moscow. In his long-term model until 2028, he predicted not a redivision of the world by war, but a spreading of subjectivity. In this scenario, Ukraine is not a player but a root node, and whoever controls the node controls the new rule.